Cat, A Tale of Feminine Redemption by Marie-Louise von Franz. Chapter 5, The Kingdoms. At the moment when the girl turns into a cat and disappears with all her servants, the fairy tale abruptly stops and goes to the masculine kingdom, and now a new theme is introduced. Now, in a faraway country, there was an emperor with 3 sons. His wife had died, and he had begun to drink. As he wanted to get rid of his children, he called all 3 sons to him and said, "I will give you some orders. Whoever is capable should bring me linen material that is so thin one can blow it through and pull it through a needle. Every one of you shall bring me something and make me a present, and then I shall see who is the biggest hero." That sets the 3 sons off on their adventures. Now we have to analyze what that other round would mean. A male quaternity where the wife has died and the father has taken to drink. In general, the emperor would be a ruling collective principle, a dominant of collective life. Now here there is another dominant. I showed earlier that sometimes in a story you have different kingdoms, which means that a civilization has already fallen apart and there are different realms that have different dominants. So you can simply say at the time the fairy tale originated, there is another dominant of collective life where there is not a sterile feminine principle as in the first part, but rather a lack of the feminine. The Empress has died. What could that mean? The Virgin Mary clearly makes it a fairy tale of the Christian age. It could be the Protestant Church, but in Romania that plays no role. In those countries, Protestantism has never really been taken in. You have on the one side a sterilization of the feminine, and on the other an elimination of the feminine. I would say that would be a development within the church that was hostile toward the feminine, even in the form of the cult of the Virgin. There was a tremendous uproar in certain church circles. Many thought there was already too much fuss made of the Virgin Mary. And one should not encourage Mariology in the church. For instance, many of the scholastic teachers, such as the Jesuits, do not encourage the cult of the Virgin. There were 2 quite different directions, so in our story I would take the second kingdom rather as a dominant male religious consciousness within the church, but one which moved even further away from the feminine. You see that, for instance, in scholastic philosophy, which is purely male. There is no feminine eros in it, and then it is a power organization like certain orders, the order of the persecution of the heretics and so on. They rarely give up eros. Even more, they went right into purely male power politics and into intellectualism. Within the church, there were those 2 streams. Even when the Pope declared the Assumption, there was quite a revolt among certain cardinals and bishops. They turned against the Pope and expressed their regrets that such a thing had been done. Their attitude was stern. That's not what we need now in the church. That softens our position. We must be like a granite block, standing for the confession, and so on. So the second kingdom would be a world where the feminine has become lost and the emperor drinks. In the Inquisition, for instance, the men who persecuted heretics and witches were drunk with a wrong spirituality. If you read the reports of that time, those men were most self-righteous. They were convinced they were cleansing the world of something terrible. So this wrong spirituality and alcoholism mostly has to do with having lost a connection with the real spirit, and therefore grabbing desperately at a surrogate spirit of some kind is the operative image. A drunkenness that has to do with power and with deterioration of the anima. In the late stages of drinking, you have probably seen such tragic cases. Men become sentimental, effeminate, full of resentments, complaining, making poisonous remarks, mentally dissolved. They present a picture of anima possession, completely at the mercy of their moods, and when they are not drinking, they are depressed and resentful. Then also the abandonment complex. Nobody loves me. I drink because nobody loves me. I drink because I'm so sad that I drink. All the kind of perverse anima stuff. Of course, that's only in tragic, extreme cases, but you see how the anima deteriorates, so to speak, through the drinking. But without the anima, they can't relate, and so they lose all their relationships. One doesn't know if the deterioration of the anima causes the drinking or is caused by drinking. But whichever comes first, they always go together. So this emperor wants to get rid of his children. Very often a king or emperor gives tasks to his sons, but generally he does it because he doesn't know to whom he should leave his kingdom. He sets such tasks to settle the decision of who shall be his successor. Our emperor also does that later, but here he doesn't. He is probably so drunk that he hasn't even a purpose in mind. So it is said he just gives them the task to get rid of them. He's no longer a husband, and he's also no longer a real father. Probably the sons have sometimes said, "Come, father, don't drink so much," and taken the bottle away, so he wants to get rid of them. That would again be this old principle, being stuck, and no longer wanting to cooperate with the possibility of the future, wanting to block it, wanting to suppress anything that leads toward or into the future. But he still has an original fantasy, namely that they should bring him some very fine linen. Now, linen is a pure vegetable fiber and was therefore used for the garments of priests and magicians in antiquity. It was also used in Germanic courts, for instance in Norway and in Gaelic countries, as an apotropaic substance. It was said that ghosts, especially water spirits, were washing and bleaching linen. In some tales, linen dresses are worn by dwarves and forest maidens, and sometimes linen is a precious gift from them, or linen patches transformed into gold pieces. If linen is a gift of a female water spirit, then it doesn't end when used, but only 1 yard is left, because a little spirit in frog shape is sitting in it. Very often linen is a symbol of a light cloud, which also shows a spiritual quality. Linen has a healing power. For instance, in Ireland, where particular remedies have to be wrapped in pure linen before using. Linen pieces also serve directly as a remedy or as a means to transfer illness. One passes linen over warts or some other diseased spot of the body and then puts the linen into a coffin. In Brandenburg, a newborn child has to be wrapped in pure linen and no other cloth because otherwise it might run after the other sex later on. Among the Czechs, the child is wrapped in linen and then put under the table so that it will be intelligent. In northern Germany, someone takes white linen, which is often inherited or is a sheet of the dead, to investigate the future on New Year's night. Dreams of white things and therefore also of linen point to death. In Romanian tradition, a dream of linen refers to a journey, wherein it is important whether the linen is seen spread out or rolled up. So, referring to our fairy tale, we might say that the white linen is a textile belonging to the realm of spirits, related to the spiritual world. This is also shown by the emphasis on its transparency and delicacy. In addition, there is an accentuation of the feminine spirits who are connected with linen, so that we can also look at it as the requisite of the mother goddess. One has only to think of spinning and weaving as a special feature of the Great Mother. For instance, the 3 Norns of Parsi, who weave the fates. So the linen in our story points to a special fate, also a fate woven in the spiritual realm with a spiritual goal, which in the form of fine linen can cure the illness of the times. There is a grim fairy tale, The 3 Feathers, where the king gives his sons the getting of linen as a task, and the one who brings the finest will have the kingdom. But then when they bring the linen, he says that was only a beginning, and now they must bring the most beautiful bride. So the linen in that story is just the initial connection with the feminine. It is only a thread, which then leads to the feminine figure. Well, here it gets interrupted. That motif doesn't come through. How would we interpret the fact that this drunken emperor, who no longer has a wife, wants linen? Linen has to do with fate, with destiny, with the feminine. It is vegetative, in contrast to wool, which is an animal product that points to its purity. The Pythagoreans, for instance, dressed only in linen cloth, nothing from sheep, and then it also has to do with permeability. You can transfer illnesses or you can exercise with it. That always means that things which are very pure are also very easily contaminated. You have the same idea in the folk belief that the innocent young sheep are the most easily bewitched, and so on. The most frequently bewitched thing in agricultural countries is milk, which is a symbol of innocence and innocent thinking. So the linen has, on the one side, the idea of innocence and a strange connection with the possibility of being contaminated or bewitched. Thus, the anima fantasy of our drunken emperor, which confirms what we thought about him, is mainly too pure. It is too far from reality, too fine, too ideal, too beautiful, not contaminated with evil, and that fits with the Inquisition and the persecution of witches and so on. If you could have talked to the persecutors, they would have said a woman must be pure, a woman must be chaste, a woman must obey her husband. Some absolutely demanding, inhuman ideal of femininity, and any woman who doesn't fit into that is a witch. That also shows that the more one has such a fantasy, a wrong fantasy of purity, the more can the devil and death and evil get into it. You have that not only in the medieval church, you could say the same, for instance, about the 19th century in higher English and Anglo-Saxon circles. It is the ideal of the lady. A lady doesn't curse or get angry, and a lady doesn't even know that she has a belly and genitals. One doesn't speak about such things. The word belly is forbidden. A lady doesn't use that word, and on and on and on. That's linen. That's an anima fantasy of men, and most painful for women if they have to perform according to such a pattern. But many of us perhaps will also still have been taught that we ought to be ladies, a most depressing affair. And behind it is a lecherous old man, an evil drunkard, who, when he has a beautiful daughter-in-law, knows nothing more intelligent than to just go and stretch his paws out after her. That fits the lady fantasy of such gentlemen. They are full of dirt themselves, and as you see at the end of the story, he behaves absolutely like a dirty old man, but he has these sentimental lady fantasies. I think that needs no comment. The pure, ideal lady fantasy predominated during late Christian development. At the same time, there was a whole underground culture of prostitution where those men lived the other side of their anima. They married a lady and then they went to a brothel, because with a lady it was obviously not interesting. So there is this absolute split of the feminine image in our civilization and in man's anima. It splits the anima in men and splits the women because the women cannot be themselves. They have to form according to such collective ideas. In itself, anything woven can be a pattern. In German, we have the expression, a woven way of life. We say, the thread of destiny, the thread of life. But what is that in psychological terms? Eros weaves connections between us and others, but the connections can also be internal. Connection is a good word for it. For instance, we speak of a web of associations, where all the amplifications of an archetype form a web. They all link up with each other and are interwoven. That is why Jung says the archetypes are contaminated. Contaminated in Latin means interwoven, so our mental processes are like a web of associations. Our feeling processes are like a web. We make connections, but mainly with our fantasy. Mostly weaving has to do with fantasy work, which is also a form of association and making connections. Creative fantasy is a web. If you do it in an active imagination, you weave a cloth, and that is why it has to do with the idea of destiny, because the unconscious fantasies of people are their destiny. The web of destiny really is the fabric of one's unconscious fantasies. You see that, for instance, when people in analysis complain of bad luck all the time. They find the wrong partner. They get into the wrong position. They make wrong choices. And then when you go into it deeper, you find that they say to themselves, I always knew it would go wrong. I knew that. Their animus, or anima, had already woven the fantasy that they were unlucky and always would be. That is like a curse, a destiny that makes them do all the wrong things. When they go from one bad situation to another, they always have that feeling inside. I knew it would all turn out wrong. With me, it could not be otherwise. With me, it will go wrong again. If you can fish up a destructive fantasy from the back of their mind, make it conscious, then you can sometimes break the spell and stop that run of bad luck. So weaving has to do with unconscious associations, unconscious fantasies that have a suggestive influence, and you can apply that to all the amplifications I have made. Now, in our story, the three sons go away. But first, they have a feast to say goodbye and to be together, and then each chooses his way. The first goes where he has to be hungry and gets nothing to eat, but he has a horse, and with that he got along. There are parallels in one, a Russian fairy tale. The three sons of the Tsar go out and come to a notice which says, "He who rides to the right side will remain hungry, but his horse will have enough to eat. He who goes to the left will have enough to eat, but his horse will be hungry. He who goes straight ahead will suffer death." The eldest goes to the right and brings a copper snake back to his father and gets chased away. The second eldest goes to the left and falls into a brothel, caught by a prostitute, and never comes home again. The youngest, who rides straight ahead, goes through a terrible difficulty and finally becomes the Tsar, and he is the hero of the story. The death he goes through is naturally a symbolic death. He is not actually killed. This motif in our story is really the same as in that Russian fairy tale, but is not very clear. The oldest went one way, where he went hungry because he had nothing to eat, but he had a horse, and the horse could eat. Therefore he went on, and he only found the little dog. The second brother had something to eat, but his horse was hungry, and he finds a little bit of linen that could go through a needle if one tried really hard. The third gets lost in a terrible rainstorm in the forest. The third son would correspond to the Russian hero, who also gets into trouble but finds the princess, the beautiful Maria. The one on the right has nothing to eat but his horse is fed, and he finds not much. The other goes to the left and has food, but his horse has nothing to eat, and he doesn't find much either. Rider and horse symbolize a person carried by instinctual vital forces. One substructure, our body, is an animal. The horse has to do with the vitality of this substructure. Very often people dream that horses are hurt or in bad shape. They fall ill. Something is the matter with their bodies, because symbolically it is the horse body that carries the soul. It also has to do with vitality. We still measure the force of our cars by horsepower, so very often in modern dreams the car takes over the role of the carrying substructure. Once I dreamt at the end of a semester when I was very tired that I saw my old car rolling with somebody else driving it. And there were black clouds coming out of the back, and I thought, oh, the poor thing must go in the garage and be repaired. Then I knew that was the moment for a holiday. If I went on working, then I would get the flu or something. So the unconscious had just chosen the car to illustrate the horse. Now, if you go to the right, it means you follow consciousness. The eldest brother has nothing to eat but his horse eats. He consciously starves himself and keeps his horse going. I think the choosing of the way incidentally means the choosing of a way of life, how to go on from now. And since he chooses not to eat but to have his horse well fed, I would say he chooses a materialistic way. He sees that he has money and health and that his horse is well fed. His body, his physical being is well fed. But he starves his spiritual side. That would mean where it is good, there I have to live. That is the main thing, and spiritual things are unimportant. And accordingly, his brother finds only a little dog. That fits this picture. The second brother has something to eat, but the horse has nothing. He would be the aesthete. He would say that the important things are spiritual values and human relationships, and neglect his physical and material needs. He finds some linen, but it is rather coarse. That confirms that linen has to do with a high-up, aristocratic anima ideal, an aesthetic and ascetic anima ideal, the lady ideal of the feminine. When a man is married to a lady, his horse may have nothing to eat, but it's still very nice to present her to others in a drawing room. So he has something for this side of his personality, even though his horse goes hungry. Then comes the youngest, and he goes the middle way. He just goes ahead, so he remains between the opposites. He doesn't let himself be seduced into falling into the one-sidedness of either the physical or the spiritual, neither the white nor the black. He just continues straight on his way between the opposites. At once this takes him into a dark forest, and that is where he will find the cat palace. He goes deep into the unconscious, the vegetative realms of the unconscious, and there he is taken by surprise by a terrific rain, so that he can't even see his own fingers. He is desperate. It rains for 3 days and 3 nights, and all the time it is pitch black. And on the third morning, lightning lights up the whole area, revealing a palace. He says, I will go straight to that palace. I can't go on anymore, whatever happens. Now we come to the symbolism of the rain. The most terrible rain most of us know is the great flood described in the Bible, caused by the wrath of God, who wanted to destroy mankind. If somebody dreams there is a flood, at first you may conclude that God is angry. But what does that mean in psychological terms? What happens if somebody dreams God is angry? First, we call the God image the self. I would say that the whole collective unconscious is in an upheaval, and that there is disharmony in the conscious behavior of the collective, and that the unconscious is brooding on destruction. That is our situation now. The unconscious toys with the idea of destroying us, which is why, for instance, if you analyze many people, you see an enormous amount of terribly destructive dreams of atom bomb explosions and the end of the earth. Such dreams have to be taken seriously, because either they might be prophetic and mean that the end is coming, or, at least, if we escape once more, then it could mean that the collective unconscious has been so badly treated by our not understanding it that it has turned destructive against us, against the collective. Because nobody needs the collective unconscious. The unconscious is angry. That's the anger of God. The kind of anger that erupted to cause the flood. Because the Jewish people didn't keep his commandments. If we translate this idea into our modern idiom, it would mean that they hadn't followed the meaningful trends of the unconscious. They did not follow the energies of the collective unconscious. They had sinned against the unconscious, so that they were flooded by it. If you sin against the unconscious possesses you. When somebody dreams of a flood, it means either that that person will fall into a depression or a disorientation, a drowning, but quite as often into a possession, an ideological obsession, for instance, an ism that is also a drowning. Khomeini was a drowned man, a man who had his head under the water. I wanted first to show the negative side of rain, but there are also positive associations in the idea of solatio, of fertilization. Then the rain is interpreted more as a fertilization, like the Nile, which floods each year and supports abundant crops. The Greeks interpreted the rain as a loving embrace of Zeus and Demeter, the sky god and the earth, a uniting of the opposites. And in the I Ching, for instance, you have many oracles where it says, when the rain falls, good luck. So literally, when the rain falls, there is a solution. Solution in the play of the words, the alchemical solution, the dissolution, which is also the solution of a problem, the melting of the opposites, which have hardened against each other and have built up tension. It is the release of a tension. That's why one feels so wonderful after a thunderstorm. When you walk out in nature after a thunderstorm, you feel physically relieved. I always think of how before a storm you feel nervous, the dog is restless, you have a headache, and so on, and then comes the rain, and after the rain, you go out into the sunshine. It's just like a rebirth of everything. You feel it, and the whole country seems to be reborn. The storm in our story has thunder and lightning, so here we have an even greater release of tension. The opposites come together, create a solution, and the tension dissolves. Seeing a flash of light means to have an insight. It can be into a whole structure of the universe or the structure of the Godhead. In a flash of lightning, you see it all. Jacob Boehm had such a lightning experience, and it took him years and years to write it out in his words, what he actually saw, condensed in one moment, in a flash. So it has to do with revelation, a sudden insight from the unconscious. That's why shamans are always connected with the idea of lightning. For instance, in certain Eskimo tribes, if somebody is hit by lightning and survives, or if somebody is very nearly hit by lightning, if it strikes just beside them, that is a sign he is called to be a shaman. So, to be struck by lightning or have lightning come quite close to you means that the spirits, the ghosts of the gods, aim at you. Zeus and Jupiter were always throwing lightning bolts. It is a sign, an action from the highest god, and many still see it so. There is the famous story that when Jung was away on holidays in Cernin in the Berner Oberland, lightning struck the church there, and then they went around and begged for money to pay for a new church, and one person said, "I'm not going to pay him for a new church if he sets fire to his own house." So there is still the idea that it is a manifestation from God, a sign of his wrath or blessing, or electing or enlightening somebody. In our story, it clearly has the quality of enlightenment because the young man suddenly sees the cat palace. Later you see that the cat arrives lightning at the court. She always comes in a thunderstorm. In a thunderstorm, a cat's skin becomes electric. They were the animals of sailors who apparently brought cats onto the ships, and when something went wrong, there was a big storm which was brought about by cats. People dreamed of thunderstorms, and we say one goes thundering through the house, or People dream of thunderstorms, and we say one goes thundering through the house, or father thundered at the table, and so on. A thunderstorm is an outbreak of affect that goes together with being enlightened. Generally, when one is in a terrific emotional upheaval, then one has sudden insights. They go together. How is the cat, the dark feminine, connected with that? What must women do to help men develop? There is a favorite story of the Hopi who once lived under the earth, and there was an overpopulation problem. The Hopi men did nothing about it, but then the women became so intolerable that the Hopis made up their mind to climb a level higher. Then they settled again and everything went right, and then again there was an overpopulation and the men did nothing. They would have gone on like that forever if the women hadn't become so impossible, making scenes from morning till night. Then the men got going. That is still true, and that is why the doctrine of a lady who should never raise her voice and always be like the Virgin Mary really causes her husband to remain asleep about his anima problem. If she doesn't make a thunderstorm from time to time, he generally doesn't wake up. He just doesn't see. So our hero suddenly sees the palace of the cat in the thunderstorm, in the upheaval, and realizes he absolutely must go to it. There he finds a very strange thing, a piece of meat, like the leg of a deer or something, and it's hanging on a wall. In reality, it's not meat, but consists of emeralds and other precious stones. He climbs up to get the meat, and he gets caught by his foot. It acts like a trap. At that moment, he hears a bell, and he is afraid he will fall down. The door opens, and somebody comes, and so on. So he was really attracted by a false piece of meat, made of precious stones, but he is hungry. He thinks he wants to have meat, but he gets hold of precious stones. He gets caught with his foot in these precious stones, and then he enters the cat palace. We have not yet put the earlier part into perspective, what it really means. One can interpret motifs in midair, so to speak, and get all the connections between them, and it looks as if you're following the context of the story. But then you must ask yourself, now, what does that mean in practical life? What is it that actually happened? But first, I will discuss the strange motif of a chunk of meat, which is like a bait that captures our hero when he comes to the palace, and then go back and look at what leads up to his strange and unique motif that I have never found in any other fairy tale. So he is terribly hungry and he climbs up to get it, and when he comes near he sees that it isn't meat, it is a chunk of precious stones. But he has touched it with his foot and gets caught in it, and there he is hanging, caught like a fish. Then he falls, a door opens below the wall, and he is pulled into the cat palace. It is unfortunate that in English one makes a distinction between flesh and meat. In German there is only one word, Fleisch, so it's quite clear what it is because the Bible speaks about it all the time. Fleshly desires, living in the flesh, and so on. Anglo-Saxons call a pig, but when you eat it they call it pork, and they call sheep, and then when you eat it they call it mutton. I think that's hypocrisy because they are just trying to conceal the fact that they are really eating pigs and sheep. But mutton, that's dead, objective. There's no murder in it. The French also have that difference. Viande for meat and chair for flesh. But in German it is the same, and actually, in fact, it is the same. It is a bit of flesh, an animal's flesh, flesh from which we live. It's one of our basic nourishments. At some time, our ancestors on the ape level changed from being vegetarians to being omnivores, eating everything, and we have kept to that. If you think of the amplification of flesh, then I think we needn't say much more about it, though you will see that the flesh contains a mystery. It isn't so simple, but if you take it at face value, it is simply the physical, fleshy reality, our body reality. And our prince is tremendously hungry for that. Now, if you think our story is about having to redeem the feminine, mainly the feminine shadow of the Virgin Mary, then it becomes more interesting that flesh is used as bait. The Virgin Mary has no contact with the flesh. She is never represented naked in sacred pictures. She is always well veiled and her body is not visible. Her flesh is discreetly hidden. So that is one part of the unredeemed shadow side of the feminine from a Christian standpoint. Our hero is quite naively and naturally hungry for that flesh, and so far that would be easy. You could say the cat catches him by his physical desires, and that, in a way, if we take it from a man's standpoint, is natural because generally the anima first appears in a man as physical desire. For instance, a sexual fantasy. Then when he goes after it, he finds it isn't flesh, but only a mirage of flesh, and is actually a lot of precious stones. It is a tantalizing situation, and I'll jump ahead now to say that we know the story from the man's standpoint is about the assimilation of the anima, her redemption, and from a woman's standpoint, redemption of the feminine. The dead flesh is only a tease, a mirage, which the unconscious uses as bait, but then takes away. We have to put the accent on the dead aspect. The anima and the feminine body is of no value if the man looks at it as being dead meat he can eat. If a man treats a woman as a good beefsteak to eat, then he misses the anima. As our hero is meant to redeem the anima, the unconscious quite rightly takes it away from him, attracts him with it, but then takes it away. It teases him in order to make him realize that it looks like what he wants, but it isn't. The unconscious says, "Look, the real thing is a precious stone." But in the mood he is in, hungry and wanting to eat, he just feels irritated. Then comes the strange detail that his foot is caught on those jewels. Naturally, one would imagine he says, "Oh damn, that's no use to me in my situation. Goodbye." But then he is magically caught and can't get away, like a fish on a baited hook. Now we have to amplify that. There is a grim fairy tale where a dumpling receives a golden goose. He walks through a village and everyone wants to touch the goose to see if it is alive or not. They are attracted by the gold. First, the innkeeper's daughter comes and touches the goose. Then her sister follows. Then the parson comes and touches the last girl. Then the others come, and then they all become stuck to each other. So they march one after the other, all magically attached to the golden goose. The story is about a king whose daughter is always sad, so he sets a competition, and whoever can make his daughter smile will inherit the kingdom. And when the dumpling arrives with that queue of people all attached to the golden goose, the princess howls with laughter and is redeemed. It's a funny, not so significant fairy tale. It is important in our present connection because there is this idea of the magic attachment. Psychologically, the attachment is an unconscious fascination by which one loses one's freedom of choice, becoming attached to the most crazy things under circumstances. And there you see already the deeper meaning of what the anima can do. The anima is the goddess Maya, illusion, and now she catches him with an unconscious fascination. He can't get away. His foot is not free. Though he has found what he does not want, he can't pull away. So he is, as in a tarot card, the hung up fool. That means also his strong point is, I have my feet on the earth and want now a good chunk of meat because I am hungry. Then they are precious stones, and suddenly he is turned over in the wrong direction, which he doesn't like, but he's caught. At that moment he hears a bell and he lets himself fall down. A door opens and a hand pulls him in, so he says, well, I will go in, whatever will happen. He goes around and sees only a table with one candle and a bed, and he says, oh well, I'll go in there and rest because I am wet from the rain. Then come all these initiation tortures where he comes closer to the cat lady. So now that we have this bit of the story, I would like to go back and say what it all is. We saw that the emperor who drinks says that his sons should bring him a bit of linen which is so fine and so subtle that it goes through a needle. And we had come so far as to say such a bit of textile has to do with the unconscious fantasy, the creative unconscious fantasy, which is the web of destiny, which is really fantasized by our own inner life. Now this drunken old emperor has a very sublime fantasy. A bit of linen so fine that it can go through the eye of a needle would be a sublime, very subtle fantasy. Linen is a feminine symbol, so is this web of associations. A creative fantasy web is a feminine symbol such as the web of Maya in Hindu philosophy. Going back, we remember that the old emperor does not have the fantasy. He only wishes for it. He wishes for the right fantasy. However, as we know from the end of the story, he behaves very broadly and has to be defeated and is possibly even killed, or if not, at least reduced to powerlessness. So it is insufficient to have that positive fantasy, but it sets the sun going. How does one interpret the old principle, the king being the old principle of consciousness, having a right kind of wishful fantasy, but being reduced to not getting it, and failing his task all the same? It's clear what it means, but how would it look in daily life if the ruling principle has the right kind of desire, but when the fantasy fulfills itself, so to speak, then he misbehaves? Well, one could say that we are now in such a situation. I think all the leading powers in the world would agree that what we need is greater protection of nature, more love among people, all these ideals, a better relationship to nature, and we mustn't exploit our planet, and on and on and on. Our technology is too inhumane. You read in every newspaper that we should go back to a more austere life. We should reevaluate human relationship, reevaluate creative individual fantasy, and we should have more individual freedom. The state should not be so overpowering. It's absolutely no achievement to have those wishful fantasies. Everybody has them. Even the old system has them. It's not just the young who have those idealistic demands. You can analyze people of 80 and they will all say those things too. The old are generally full of reasonable wishful fantasies, but they don't know how to go about it. The disease of the old emperor is that when he comes to facts, he doesn't know how to go about it because his wife is dead. Now, what does it mean that his wife is dead? What is the feminine? If we take it that his anima is dead, then that would be a male society and the feminine would be the anima quality. Mainly, I would say that the anima in a man and the feminine in a woman is what brings things into reality. If a man has no wife, then it means that he may have the most marvelous fantasies, but when it comes to realizing them, he is lost. The feminine is what carries them out. Just as a man generates a child, but the woman brings it to birth, into life. So, if a man's anima is dead, if he has no relation to his inner femininity, then he might be the greatest idealist in the world and have marvelous plans to reform the world's situations, but when it comes to pulling them into reality, he will be at a loss. That is typical of the old emperor, who despairs at having lost his wife and begins to drink. Like a disappointed idealist, so to speak. If a man has developed his anima, he sees opportunities where he can put his ideals into reality because he is personally related. He sees not only committees, he also sees people. You can only realize things through individuals, not through committees and newspaper articles. That is developing the feminine principle, and then the man has the right fantasy. He sees the opportunities in reality which evolve into personal relationships. You can have the best system for the world, but if the people are not related in it, If you have, for instance, a marvelous team of scientists and they all hate each other, they will never produce anything. If the anima is deficient, there is always sterility. Think of the fairy tale mentioned earlier, The Three Feathers, where the king first gives his three sons the task of finding such very fine linen, and when they bring it, he says, "Now I want each one to bring the finest bride." So there, the old king leads on from the fantasy into reality, as if he would say, first we must have a web, a creative fantasy, but then we must also put it into reality. There it ends harmoniously, while in our story it does not, because as soon as the emperor sees the beautiful woman, he wants her for himself and ruins the whole situation. But we will come to that later. If we look at this web the old emperor wants as an ideal fantasy, which is on the right track, but because of losing his wife, he lacks the possibility of realizing it. Then you can understand what happens to the eldest son who finds a coarse web, a coarse bit of textile, and the middle one who finds a dog. These two brothers do not play much of a role later. Why does one find a coarse bit of linen, which means something like what the father wants, but not as good? And why does the other find a dog? Remember that the direction of the story, the goal, is the redemption of the feminine. I would say that this coarse bit of linen, if you compare it with the ideal linen the emperor had in mind, is only keeping to the coarse outlines of life. For instance, a politician who has a marvelous, beautiful fantasy of how things should be and then says, "Oh well, in politics one has to be realistic. Let's just do the best we can." Then it's kind of coarsely applied and loses its true value because there is no soul in it. It's dead, an ordinary bit of linen. That's just trivial and it ends in triviality. You could say, for instance, he finds something that is approximately what he hoped for, but he puts up with it and thinks, well, that's probably how reality is. You can't ask for something later. Companionship through a dog would be a kind of blind, uncritical faithfulness. Jung has always said it's the men who believe in the institution of marriage, not the women. Women doubt marriage all the time because they are really only passionate about relationships. That's what they want. But a man often has a very sentimental idea. He really doesn't get along with his wife at all, but she is his wife. I've seen that in those tragedies where a man has really married the wrong woman and then falls in love with one more suitable, but then he has this sentimental feeling. My wife is my wife. I cannot divorce her. Even if there are no children, he has a kind of dog's loyalty from habit. I knew of a man who went 10 times to a lawyer and discussed the whole divorce and then got the jitters when he had to tell his wife. He wavered to and fro like that for 15 years. There was absolutely no love left. It was not that he secretly still loved her. It was just the dog attachment and a sentimental feeling. Divorce as a social shame. It's not what one does. It's also an attachment to the old conventional principle. Women are in that way more adventurous. They may love the institution of marriage, but only if they are happy with the men in it. If they are not happy with the man, they quickly begin to have unconventional fantasies. They throw over personal considerations more easily. So you can say both ways, to the right and left, would be triviality, resignation, being loyal, replacing real relatedness by thinking, oh, we get along. The coarse linen would be, oh, we get on approximately all right. It isn't the real love I dreamt about in my youth, but we're getting on. Such a man buries, so to speak, his anima ideal, or what his anima is really seeking in him. He gives up, or then comes the dog.